In the cultural case of the Walt Disney Company versus Middle America, that is to say, the demographic that they depend and have depended upon most heavily for many, many decades to drive both top and bottom line revenues, well, it seems that Middle America and their wallets are winning. This today from a somewhat unlikely source, IGN, a typically left-of-center publication when it comes to entertainment and gaming, comes out with this article. Inside Out 2 was the hit that Pixar needed, but the laid-off employees who crunched on it are still hurting. And in this article, they may have just stumbled on one unassailable fact. That's right, kids. It's a hashtag Renegade was right episode here at the Renegade Nation because clearly we're about to prove that woke broke Disney. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell. Share this sucker out on the social medias. And of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. Make sure to join us every Sunday and Wednesday afternoon for the live show. This article recently from IGN, again, has proven some things that we've discussed here on the Renegade Nation for quite a few years. And that namely is that woke broke Disney. And we need to take a walk down memory lane to fully appreciate the context of what we're about to read here. In March of 2022, Variety magazine followed up on a previous story from just a few weeks earlier. Same-sex kiss has been restored in Pixar's Lightyear following a staff uproar over the Don't Say Gay bill, or the quote-unquote Don't Say Gay bill. This was a piece of legislation that was being passed through the House and Senate in the state of Florida. But what it actually was House Bill 1557, the Parental Rights in Education bill, that simply said this: if you're a child in kindergarten, first, second, or third grade, then your teacher is not allowed under state law to discuss anything of a sexual or gender nature. That is to say, we can't talk about heterosexual or homosexual things. We can't talk about gender identity to kids this young. It seems a pretty simple thing in law, something that shouldn't even have to be passed in a sane society, but yet here we are. Of course, the crazies out there glommed onto it as an anti-gay bill, quote unquote. Of course, it wasn't, because it never even said the word gay in the bill itself. But be that as it may, the usual suspects of the Walt Disney Company went into a tizzy over this because, of course, this was some type of assault on their quote-unquote community. On March 9th of 2022, LGBTQ employees and allies at Pixar Animation Studios sent a joint statement to the Walt Disney Company leadership claiming that Disney executives had actively censored, quote, this was Pixar's words, overtly gay affection in its feature films. The stunning allegation, made as part of a larger protest over the company's lack of public response to Florida's, quote, Don't Say Gay bill, did not include which Pixar films had weathered the censorship, nor which specific creative decisions were cut or altered. According to a source close to the production, Pixar's next feature film of that year, Lightyear, starring Chris Evans as the putative real-time inspiration for the Toy Story character Buzz, does feature a significant female character, Hawthorne, who is in a meaningful relationship with another woman. While the fact of that relationship was never in question at the studio, a kiss between the characters had been cut from the film. Following the uproar surrounding the Pixar employee's statement and Disney CEO Bob Chapek's handling, quote-unquote, of the Don't Say Gay bill, however, the kiss was reinstated to the movie last week. And again, for those of you that may not recall, let's take another walk down memory lane at how well this movie did in the box office. Yep, it sucked. This was one of the worst theatrical performances in the history of Pixar, especially when you adjust things for inflation, and especially even further when you consider the fact that Lightyear was connected to the most successful franchise that Pixar had ever produced or created. In fact, the franchise that started Pixar, that was Toy Story. Lightyear was an unmitigated financial disaster for the Walt Disney Company, but that wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning, and not just for Pixar, but for Walt Disney Animation as a whole. Later that year, things got even worse, with Strange World pulling in a mere $70 million in global box office. And this movie, just like Lightyear, featured prominently, at least for a children's entertainment film, an LGBTQ character and relationship. Both Lightyear and Strange World came with production budgets of roughly $200 million, at least insofar as Disney has put out there in public. Now, of course, that wouldn't include things like marketing, which Disney may have spent easily another $100 million per film on. That's generally how things work. And we've told you in the past that when it comes to Disney Animation and Pixar Studios at the Walt Disney Company, generally speaking, these films need to rake in about $600 million just to think about breaking even. Now, over the past several years, we have had many on social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, you name it, that have called us absolutely crazy for making such statements. Except the problem is they're completely accurate. And that fact is even confirmed in this article. Let's go through it. From the outside, Pixar's narrative is a clear story of redemption. After an undeniably tough few years battered by the COVID-19 theater shutdowns, 2 Hollywood strikes, and a couple of box office disappointments, the studio needed a win, and that was Inside Out 2. And indeed, that was a win. Nearly, to this point, $1.7 billion globally for this film that cost, allegedly, roughly $200 million, although I think if history is any guide with the Walt Disney Company, that figure is actually pretty light. I think it might have come in probably $50 to $100 million more than that. But even with that, even if Disney's all-in cost was, say, $400 to $500 million to complete this film, and we think that that overage is for reasons that we'll discuss in this very article from IGN, Disney still would have taken home about $800 million or so of the total worldwide box office, meaning they would have turned a healthy profit from this film. And that's something that Disney has not done with a movie since 2019.
That's according to a number crunch by prominent YouTuber Valiant Renegade, who argues that many of Disney's recent so-called hits barely broke even or flat out tanked.
The sequel to Pete Docter's Oscar-winning 2015 blockbuster Inside Out is Pixar's biggest hit in years, and it's not even close. Inside Out 2 isn't just Pixar's highest-grossing film, it's the highest-grossing animated movie of all time. And again, that is, of course, completely unadjusted for any real movie ticket price inflation. But for many of the workers, as IGN refers to them, behind Inside Out 2, its record-shattering success is more than a little bittersweet. As reported earlier this year, the studio began layoffs affecting about 175 employees. Let's use the proper phrase here, or 14% of its staff in May. And not only are laid-off employees unable to benefit from a bonus for Inside Out 2's success, some are also recovering from what several sources describe as a, quote, unprecedented crunch surrounding Inside Out 2. Now, this is where things get terribly interesting. What kind of crunch would this be? We've discussed for many years here on the Renegade Nation about how the crunches typically affected most Disney fare, in particular things like Marvel Productions time and time and time and time and time again, where there was no planning in the beginning. There was really no serious writing and pre-production done. Kevin Feige at Marvel Studios had an attitude of shoot everything and storybook it and then slap it all together in the end in front of a bunch of test screening audiences and see what worked. Of course, in Marvel Phases 4 and 5, that all failed miserably. But we know that went as far back as even the Star Wars feature films that cost $560 million for The Force Awakens, $516 million to complete The Rise of Skywalker in 2019, which was literally shooting just a couple of weeks before the actual final film released in theaters. But apparently this was the case at Pixar as well, at least when it came to Inside Out 2. But the reason behind here and what happened is far more interesting. Quote, I think for a month or two, the animators were working 7 days a week, one source says. Ridiculous amounts of production workers, just people being tossed into jobs they had never really done before. It was horrendous. Right off the bat, you should be noticing that there's a lot of people at Pixar that seem to be unqualified for the jobs that they're in. And this is something that we have chronicled heavily with the Walt Disney Company over the last several years. This is kind of part of the whole DEI push, or diversity, equity, and inclusion push, where they're not hiring anymore for a lot of jobs at Disney when it comes to meritocracy or people that are most qualified to handle the work that they're being employed to do. No, it's more about diversity and representation first, being able to say that we have employees that look like this, or sleep with these people, or do this and that, or come from these backgrounds, more so than saying, you know what, we want to have the most diverse set of employees as we possibly can. But the first and foremost thing is, no matter who these employees are, we're going to make sure that we hire the most qualified people for the jobs. This has been absolutely killing Disney for several years, and this article from IGN and their sources at Pixar seem to absolutely confirm this fact. IGN spoke to 10 former Pixar employees, meaning that these folks were probably part of the recent layoffs this year. For this story, under the condition of anonymity, of course, because many of them are probably under non-disclosure agreements or NDAs, they go into detail about the pains of the layoffs, the financial struggles of those layoffs that they have been left with, and the details behind what one of the sources calls, quote, the largest crunch in the studio's history. It's a claim disputed by a senior executive at Pixar who tells IGN that the crunch at the end of the Inside Out 2 was frankly no different from those on many other films at the studio. But the fact remains, there are many who feel like they rushed to give Pixar the hit it so desperately needed, and then were hung out to dry. Now, much of the IGN article goes into details about the financial woes of those that were laid off from Pixar, and we can discuss more about that on the Wednesday live show here at 6 p.m. Eastern on Renegade Nation. But for this video, we kind of want to stick to the social political history when it comes to Pixar. But that being said, quote, I would venture at least 95% of the people that got laid off are financially effed right now, one source from Pixar says. Outside of the financial strain of it all, sources at Pixar also paint a picture of a studio that's terrified to rock the boat, with some internally pushing to avoid LGBTQ themes requiring edits to Inside Out 2. It's a studio, they say, that's overtly reliant on Chief Creative Officer Pete Docter, stubbornly set in his ways and setting its remaining team up for more crunch in future films. This statement, again, seems a little odd to me because we just showed you the article from 2.5 years ago in Variety where, well, the people at Pixar, one, they got their lesbian kiss restored to Lightyear, which went on to become a massive financial disaster for the Walt Disney Company and its shareholders. Maybe, just maybe, the Walt Disney Company should have listened to certain board members at the time, like Safra Catz, who was cited in a recent New York Times article as somebody who was very reluctant to see Disney go down the political divide. And she wasn't alone. Bob Chapek was right there with her, although unfortunately Bob Chapek bent the knee to some of the more radical cabal at the House of Mouse. And we all know how that turned out for Chapek. The internal culture of Pixar right now is really rough, one former employee says. Quote, there's just an incredible amount of people who are like, I can't do this anymore. Disney, of course, declined to comment for this story to IGN. As much as I don't want to celebrate the woes of people who have lost jobs, part of me wonders if many of these 175 some odd employees at Pixar that were laid off were actually part of the problem. If they were indeed part of that problem, then that's good news for the Walt Disney Company, their shareholders, and frankly, the Disney fans at large, because maybe that means that Disney is getting back to the old days of, I don't know, making money. And here's one of the best quotes of the article, something that we here, like I said before, on the Renegade Nation have been telling you for years. And here's proof positive. According to many of these former Pixar employees, due to the profit-sharing model at Disney Pixar, that is to say, production studio plus Disney's distribution model, a movie from Pixar in this case has to cross $600 million at the retail level at the theatrical box office in order to be considered profitable for Pixar. And it's not seen as a true hit until that coveted $1 billion box office mark. You can cue the hashtag Renegade was right thing right here, right now. Go ahead, do it. This all led to a situation where Inside Out 2, a sequel to arguably one of the most beloved animated movies ever, was seen as the film could reverse the studio's fortunes, making it what one source called a, quote, all-hands-on-deck studio emergency. It was rare, we're told, to find someone who worked at Pixar in the past couple of years who didn't contribute to Inside Out 2. One source points out that the credits for Inside Out 2 are longer than any other Pixar movie, given the amount of studio employees who were pulled in on it. Now, I want you to stop right there and ask yourselves a simple question. Why? Why was this an all-hands-on-deck affair? Forget the fact that Pixar had, to this point in the last several years, produced dud after bomb after flop after fail, and they had to get back on track. But why at this point in the production schedule was Inside Out 2 observed as such an absolute catastrophe that this was becoming a critical mass situation, a nuclear situation for the vaunted Disney studio, a studio that Disney paid billions and billions of dollars to acquire from Apple and Steve Jobs years before? Well, like we've said in the past, Pixar's biggest problem since 2017 was the lack of John Lasseter.
To make a great film, I believe you have to do three things really well. Tell a compelling story that is unpredictable, keeps the audience on the edge of their seat. You populate that story with really appealing and memorable characters, and put that story and those characters in a believable world. Believable for the story you're telling. Not realistic. We're not interested in reproducing reality.
John Lasseter was the heart and soul of Pixar, who was run off due to a bunch of Me Too allegations at the Walt Disney Company, many of which a lot of people seem to think were vastly overblown. And John Lasseter has moved on to other things. Pete Docter was left in his stead, and he's trying to clean up the mess that was left behind by Bob Iger. So far as these sources said to IGN, They believed that Pixar would fall apart if Inside Out 2 wasn't a runaway success. It was seen by many Pixar employees as a, quote, life or death situation for the studio. And I'd have to agree. Since 2019 and Toy Story 4, Pixar had found virtually no success anywhere, theatrically or on Disney+. And apparently Pete Docter, I think, was feeling an absolute tremendous amount of pressure from his boss, Alan Bergman, in particular, who runs the studio side of Disney when it comes to theatrical releases, that something had to be a hit, and it had to do it quickly. And Pete Docter took one look at this movie and said, nope, we got to fix this. That was the pressure felt by everybody. We need this movie to succeed because we won't have a studio otherwise. And that is the pressure that everybody felt the entire time, the whole time. Even now, I think people are still feeling the pressure of like, oh my God, we did it. We did it. And whether or not Pixar was actually in danger isn't confirmed, but in a Time magazine interview just before the release of Inside Out 2, Pete Docter said, quote, if this doesn't do well at the theater, I think it just means we're going to have to think even more radically about how we run our business. And he was probably correct, because one thing that I have said now for probably the last 2 years is that Disney was reaching a point that there was almost no distinction at all between Pixar and Walt Disney Animation Studios. There was a complete duplicity of executive and just overhead between these two things. One of them needed to go. In other words, these two studios needed to be consolidated into one corporate management. Pixar looked like perhaps they were on the out. All they needed at Disney was the name of Pixar, and they could move on from there. They would still have rights to, of course, all of the intellectual properties that they had purchased, but running two totally separate studios with two entirely separate and duplicative cost structures was just untenable. The unwillingness to delay the film's release persisted despite last-minute rewrites and the quiet expansion of Pete Docter's role on the film. Multiple sources say that Pete Docter stepped in as an uncredited co-director, working heavily alongside credited director Kelsey Mann. In some ways, that movie made sense to many. Pete Docter, after all, co-wrote and directed the first Inside Out, in addition to boasting directing and story credits on beloved Pixar movies like Up, WALL-E, and Toy Story. And those, of course, were some of the biggest hits that Pixar ever had. One source, in fact, said, you saw the end result of that. Inside Out 2 made $1 billion at the box office. That was a direct result of Pete Docter's involvement. Pete's a genius. Nobody can dispute this. But some sources say this is also indicative of what is a godlike worship, quote-unquote, of the man in charge, a holdover from the days of ousted Chief Executive Creative Officer John Lasseter. One source says the studio leans on Pete Docter to a, quote, unhealthy degree, and it's partially what leads to a situation like the crunch on Inside Out 2. You can't do anything without Pete, one former employee says, and that creates a bottleneck. For many, it's also a symbol of Pixar holding fast to an internal culture that's stubbornly set in its ways, with an aversion to bringing on new directors and voices. One source cites a period of time between 2020 and the release of Lightyear where the studio was more open to bringing in producers and creatives from the outside its typical ranks, as well as greener filmmakers. Mann made his directorial debut on Inside Out 2, beginning development during that more experimental period in 2020. Hold the phone. IGN and these sources just stumbled, unfortunately, on the very crux of the Walt Disney Company's problems. Hiring people that are frankly unqualified to run $200 to $300 to $400 million capital investments, CapEx projects for the Walt Disney Company, and turning them into, unfortunately in many cases in the last few years, social political experiments that have flopped over and over again at the box office. Pete Docter apparently got fed up with this at one point. This directive from Disney to perhaps hire people that didn't necessarily have the merit to command such a budget and such a massive project like some of these films from Pixar and Marvel, and throw in Lucasfilm as well. Pete Docter said, no, wait a minute. My job, my ass is on the line, and I'm not having this anymore. And the first Inside Out movie was one of my babies, and I'm not having some green behind-the-ear kid who doesn't know what the hell they're doing ruin this for me. Everything so far in this article seems to illustrate or at least support the notion that, well, at least things that we know at Disney definitively from their own corporate pablum and language and things that they put out there, their own propaganda, that yes, DEI is something that is paramount at the Walt Disney Company. Far more so over things like profits for shareholders, which is what Disney's prime directive is supposed to be, like any other publicly traded company on Wall Street. And frankly, Wall Street and Disney investors should be down on their knees thanking God that Pete Docter got a heavy hand in this one and said, enough is enough. We're doing this my way because, well, it worked. And that working process was getting rid of the woke social political mantra that Disney had been shoving down American families' throats for years, that those same American families had soundly and repeatedly rejected. Remember, back in 2021, the Walt Disney Company was trading at over $200 a share, and for the last couple of years, it's been just precariously teetering between $75 and $120 a share. Most of the times, that $120 a share was because Nelson Peltz got involved and fell back down after he got out the fight. That brief period of willingness to experiment, however, didn't last, particularly after Lightyear's financial failure. Sources say that Pixar lost the desire to take risks, either in its creative appointments or its story decisions. As reported at the time, there were many reasons why Lightyear disappointed at the box office: a confusing spin-off concept, a new voice for Buzz, growing pains in going from Disney Plus back to theatrical. Docter even admitted that it prompted, quote, a lot of soul-searching at the studio, citing some of Lightyear's conceptual and character issues. But, however, multiple sources say that Disney leadership internally put a large part of the blame for Lightyear's financial failure on a same-sex kiss in the film, which was briefly removed and then reinstated after an internal staff uproar. LGBTQ workers and allies at Pixar said leadership was censoring, quote, an overtly gay affection at a time where employees were also protesting, and the company's response to Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. Now, what's funny about that is at the time when Lightyear came out and it suffered a massive failure, we told you the biggest reason was the fact that the Pixar folks went very public with the fact that they were deliberately trying to inject, as they said, quote, overtly gay affection into what was supposed to be a children's film from the Walt Disney Company. And of course, the national news media and Pixar itself and Disney itself just seemed to gloss over the fact that most of American parents, that is to say, middle America, again, the people who have paid Disney's bills for decades, decided, sorry, this isn't for me and my children. You do your thing, but we'll just, we're going to peace out. But now, according to this article, oh no, that's actually what was on the table. That was actually what was being discussed internally at Disney, which Disney, of course, never admitted to publicly. But we knew, we told you here on the Renegade Nation, this is exactly what was going on. And now this IGN article has confirmed that. But this is where things get interesting for Inside Out 2. If you remember, months before the movie released, there was speculation that LGBTQ themes were being developed in Inside Out 2 as well. A lot of the early teasers and trailers seemed to suggest this, with the main character and some of the other supporting characters in the film. And we even heard rumors from this, which folks like myself and WDW Pro of that Park Place discussed here on the Renegade Nation. Now, when the movie came out, which was interesting, we got something from our friend Alan Ng at Film Threat, and he said his 2 words to describe his early access of viewing the film were simply this: not woke. To which we were very surprised, and we said, if that's true, then this film potentially could be a major hit, because that's something that American audiences and a lot of traditional audiences around the world, they didn't want any more of a part of. Well, that's exactly what happened, but that wasn't what was originally intended insofar as we had heard with this movie. Back to the article from IGN, the apparent hesitance to touch on LGBTQ themes and storylines in particular affected Inside Out 2's development. According to several of our sources, multiple people at Pixar who IGN interviewed recall hearing about continuous notes to make Riley, the main character of both Inside Out movies from 2015 and again in 2024, come across as quote-unquote less gay, leading to numerous edits that ramped up around September of 2023, less than a year before the movie came out, after the resolution of the WGA strike. Sources describe these rumors that there was special care put into making the relationship between Riley and Val, a supporting character introduced in Inside Out 2, seem as platonic as possible, even requiring edits to the lighting and the tone of certain scenes to remove any trace of, quote, romantic chemistry. One source describes it as, quote, just doing a lot of extra work to make sure that no one would potentially see them as not straight. Holy crap, we were right. We told you so. This movie was intended from the get-go as being another dive into LGBTQ stuff, and again, a movie intended for children. Now look, Netflix has been putting LGBTQ themes and characters and frankly just ridiculous storylines that had nothing to do with the rest of the tale being told for years. But again, most of that was adult fare. It's something that people would just gloss over and not care about or just roll their eyes as it being so forced into the story. But when you do this with children's content, you have to understand that most, and I do mean the overwhelming majority of parents out there, whether they feel comfortable expressing this publicly or not, are just not going to take their kids to it. And we have seen this made evident time and time and time and time again with Disney projects that have come out and failed miserably because of this. And of course, Lightyear wasn't the end of it. Like we told you earlier, Strange World, which was even more arguably overt than the Lightyear movie, well, yeah, we all saw what happened with that one, and it was for the very same reason. Word got out because Disney made it plain that they were going to go down that road, and their customers walked away. And the worst part is, of course, during all of this, Wall Street seemed completely inept. Wall Street seemed completely, let's say, incompetent when it came to actually asking the necessary real questions during things like the earnings calls and annual shareholder meetings to get to the heart and soul of why Disney's studios, at least in part, are failing miserably. It's worth noting that Pixar released a short in 2015 that followed Riley from Inside Out's first date with a boy. Still, many fans online started to call out, quote-unquote, queer coding in Inside Out 2 from the moment the first trailer arrived. The movie also teased a, quote, deep, dark secret that Riley was harboring throughout, only to reveal in the post-credits the secret was that she once burned a hole in the carpet. Many fans, however, thought that the reveal would be that Riley was actually grappling with her sexuality and even felt, quote, baited over what it actually was. Mind you, Riley is not canonically gay. One source says, in the film, what you saw, nothing about Riley says that she's gay, but it's kind of inferred based on certain context. And so that is something that they tried to play down at multiple points. Another source calls some leadership uncomfortable with queer themes at large, and the insistence on keeping those themes out of Inside 2 was, quote, a big thing throughout development. Or as one source puts it, it was a shit show. Now, there's a lot more to this article. And again, we're going to discuss more detail on the Wednesday live show at 6 p.m. Eastern right here on Valiant Renegade. Make sure you're here for that one as well, because we'll have some guests that might want to chime in on some of this in addition to what we've discussed here. But the bottom line is this. Disney is figuring something out. And it's not something that they're going to ever admit to openly. Disney doesn't do this, and we've told you this for nearly 4 years that we've been on YouTube. Disney does not come out and do mea culpas. They simply shift gears in the dead of night and change things. And then you just wake up and realize, oh, they did something differently now. Well, that was the case with Inside Out 2. The pressure was mounting at Disney. They had to turn something in at the box office that was a success. They were losing, or had lost completely, their definitive crown of being the king of the box office for the years leading up to COVID-19. Disney hadn't gotten back to that. They desperately needed wins this summer. They got the first one with Inside Out 2, and they got another one with Deadpool and Wolverine. 2 movies that everybody went to go see, that enjoyed, and said were, hey, not woke. Well, that's what Disney needs to continue to do. And this entire article and the very existence of Inside Out 2 as it stands currently is an admission by Disney of one thing. Their leftist politics in family entertainment simply does not work. You literally trade broke for woke. And they've seemingly started to fix this, at least for now. That doesn't mean that Disney is suddenly going to turn a corner tomorrow and clean up the entire House of Mouse. I seriously doubt that. And I don't expect Disney to get substantially better over the next several years. But we can take some small wins here to where maybe Disney shareholders can take some solace that at least their studio side are starting to understand that children's entertainment should remain innocent, and it should remain free from social politics. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.